So, so now what you want to do is actually do a deep dive into the things you've learned about church history. Is that right?
Yeah. And let me before I forget to do this again, let me just lay some groundwork here. I've never declared myself to be a historian. I am not a historian, a church historian. I've just read the books of the church historians, the Bushmans, the Vogels, the Van Wagners, the Quinns, there's too many. I don't want to, and faithful ones, right? I don't want to miss anybody here. What I've done, what I thought I was particularly, good at was aggregating, summarizing, telling it in a narrative in a simple, digestible short story that I think helps people get to the gist of what occurred. I didn't want to turn it into back and forth with apologetics. You've got CES Letter that does that. You've got Mormon Think that does that fantastically well if you want to dig deeper on a topic. So I'm not going to dig deep. I was going to summarize, introduce, and suggest some ideas, trying to stay to what's factually known and even represented and admitted by the church, which may differ greatly from what a lot of people were raised on.
But the main thing we're going to do now, I've met a lot of people. I've been doing this for 14 years.
Yeah.
And I'm basically saying, if you, the listener, want to hear perspectives from someone who's spent more time on a condensed basis than probably any of us, reading more than probably any of us have read, and hear their thoughts, what they've learned, and their conclusions, this is an important opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. And again, no one offered to show me. At no point did anybody really say, up until the very sitting down with my attorney who directed me to some resources like the CES Letter. I found the CES Letter, and this is not intended as a criticism. Others have said it was still kind of angry and still a lot of back and forth, and it was hard to follow a linear line down a path of understanding on a topic without bouncing off into these different rabbit holes. Since then, I think it's gotten better. And same thing with Mormon Think has been reorganized. The website's better. The path, the flow, the menu is better. I encourage everybody to use those resources. Let's just call out, if you really want to go to Fair Mormon, there's Fair Mormon if you want to get their take. There's a ton of stuff out there. But what I felt, quite frankly, as I compiled, so now I'm reading and compiling all my notes, right? And I showed it to some friends, and I was asking them questions about, well, what's been your experience with this? And did you know this? And do you have a different take? And am I missing something here on polygamy? I mean, and they saw my notes, and they said, hey, man, this is legit. I mean, when you saw it the first time, do you recall? I mean, you looked at the notes. My goal was to provide digestible, linear conversations, topic by topic, without devolving into a rabbit hole of apologetics.
Okay, so your intent with the essays and your intent right now, I'm just going to say, at Mormon Stories, we've never had the intent of leading people out of Mormonism, of taking people's faith away from them. But we do believe that for people who value truth and who value evidence and who value knowledge and history, those people should have a chance at knowing what the history is of the church they've based their life on. And is that the spirit with which you want to share now what you learned?
I hope so, absolutely. And there's a trajectory, there's a path. First you'll discover a certain faith-promoting Facebook group, where people are trying to find reasons to stay in and share support and stay active, and they have a lesson to teach. And how do you teach that lesson knowing that there's, falsehoods in the official version or omissions, and then you migrate perhaps to more, the next level of group or a transition group. There's so many paths through the faith journey. I call it a truth crisis. We call it a faith crisis. But again, let's hold that. Let's hold that until there's perhaps some summarizing at the end, right? I was trying not to get too much into that, but let's look at Joseph Smith. Let's look at the Book of Mormon. Let's look at some history and see what might be there.
All right. So,
and you want to mention the chronology? Because I think viewers, as we start into this, there's a chronology on your website. It's a little hard to find. It's in the drop-down menu.
You go to Truth Claims, Chronology of Mormon
Yeah,
History.
yeah. So again, I want to give credit to the real historians. I'm just an aggregator, an organizer. I've in some groups that I've gone quiet on for a while now. Historian groups where I've learned a ton from the actual, historians and experts that really know what they're talking about. And I've tried to glean from that everything possible that seemed relevant to put in that chronology. As I read, as I studied, I think it's critically important, was for me, to see in context what was occurring when. So the chronology is I think, a little more robust and helpful than you might think. I welcome corrections, additions, subtractions. It's really, I think, a powerful tool if you're interested in a certain time period or the context of what was going on.
And I'm just gonna scroll to it right now. So if you look at if you're on YouTube and you're actually watching, I'm on the chronology page, and it starts saying Chronology of Mormon History. And then it just starts in 597 BC, right? Starts at 597 BC
Babylon?
with the siege of Jerusalem.
There you go.
And it's so rich, and it goes all the way to 2045, where endangered and notoriously elusive Kurlam and Kumam discovered in remote patch of Belize jungle. I think that's a joke.
We're going to find them for sure.
You ended with the joke, but
yeah.
And you talk about Mormon all the way to Mormon leaks in 2018 and Curtin McConkie. So it's a super comprehensive chronology that just spending the time to read it really it's like its own experience.
Oh yeah, I enjoyed
read the
it.
chronology as its own book.
Well, and there's certain episodes, and let's cut to the chase here. There's some challenges with the first vision. I did not know that no one had heard about it for 20 years in the United States, that no one had heard this, story relayed. And then there was these conflicting versions. I had no idea that the priest did. I forgot. We don't know when it occurred or where it occurred. Nobody heard about that for 5 years. So a lot of what I found in the chronology was what wasn't there that should have been there, and what was changed between this doctrine and that doctrine, between when it was the Book of Commandments versus the Doctrine and Covenants, the alterations that were made that are blatantly obvious in our own church records, the entire priesthood restoration just appears, in this normal mundane scripture about whether or not you can use wine for the sacrament, So we'll get into that, but the chronology helps you see in context what wasn't there. And now you can't prove a negative, and that's the beauty of the apologists. They can take that standpoint that you can't prove it's not true, but I accept that. I can't prove pigs don't fly because no one's ever seen one, but that doesn't mean they don't fly. They might fly. Mm-hmm. We can't prove they don't fly.
Right.
But I don't think pigs fly.
Right. Yeah.
So it's kind of like you have to make up your own judgment system of what you're willing to accept and how important it is to you.
Well, let's dig in.
All right, cool. So anyway, the chronology deserved, I think, a little shout out.
Yeah.
And there's others out there.
I just shared a link and I just showed it visually. Yeah.
There's others out there that have some really good stuff, but I think too much of this information is buried in private Facebook groups where experts answer questions. But I mean, I want to get it out to more people.
And you've already said this, but I'm just going to say it again. Number one, all praise and honor be to Mormon Think.
Right.
CES Letter with Jeremy Runnels.
Yeah.
Letter to My Wife.
Absolutely.
And Fawn Brody and Michael Quinn and Dialogue and Sunstone and Mormon History Association. You are building on the shoulders of giants, and we give them all the reverence.
Absolutely.
Maybe what this offers is a narrative that's both comprehensive but sequential, and it goes into more depth. The CES Letter is what, 70, 80 pages?
Oh, I think it's more than that.
Okay, I don't know how many
sure
pages, but you've got more. I think you go deeper overall into more topics than maybe Jeremy does in his CES Letter. Not to disparage it, because that's part of the beauty of the CES Letter is it's so effective because you can get it's dense. It's just you can get to the important stuff quickly in a short amount of time.
Well, and I would suggest
this is for if you maybe want to go deeper in some areas.
Well, I would suggest maybe I didn't go as deep. I'm intentionally keeping this what you don't include and confuse and clutter people with, because there's a lot more. There's a lot more to this that I remember, because we didn't mention we actually hired a professional editor, historian type that cannot be named who helped as well, to run through this and help me clean it. Some of the essays came out, very few changes, and others we removed, sealing from the polygamy essay because we felt that was a distraction, but anyway, I think it's important to not overclaim what I'm trying to do, but there's a lot there. And I try to put as many links to original materials. There's a lot of hot links within the text, particularly on some of the pages where you can click on it. It takes you to the original source.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why don't we start with Joseph Smith?
Okay. That's a good place to start.
All right. That's kind of where it all started. And you've done, I love Dan Vogel's podcasts that you've done. And you did one with Hamer on, the origins of the Book of Mormon.
We did Sandra Tanner and
Tanner,
First Vision. Right?
There's plenty of real credible actual historians out there that can speak to this. But
Brent Metcalf.
Yeah, and Brent's in some of these, the Mormon Historians group, and they'll pop up every now and again, and someone asks a question, and boom, there you go. These people know what they're talking about. And I'm just trying to glean that and distill it down, make it available. Yeah. So Joseph Smith, the prophet seer of the Lord, has done more save Jesus Christ only for the salvation of men in this world than any other man that ever lived in it. I mean, that's, never mind for a minute that's Joseph writing that about Joseph. But that's the standard that we have been taught about Joseph Smith's importance, So I think that's an appropriate place to start. And it was covered pretty well with your other podcast, but it's worth mentioning. And this is all in the essays, but Joseph was a little more educated, and his family had a little more history with education than we were raised to believe, And education then was a lot more informal, but, it was Hiram that attended, the academy in Dartmouth. It was a prep school, and their... the Moores Academy is what it's called. And then John Smith, he was the cousin of Joseph's grandfather. I mean, he established and ran Dartmouth's, theology department. There was a school of the prophets. There's so many parallels there that we would just have to explore offline.
But I think the point there is we kind of, as believing Mormons, we want to have our cake and eat it too. We want to elevate Joseph as the most important human other than Jesus, because he's the founder of our religion, and he's the reason why we've got all this great stuff.
Miracle.
Hail to the prophet.
Right.
But then we want to also make it miraculous that he came up with the Book of Mormon and bolster that the Book of Mormon's amazing.
Right.
And we want to allow for all sorts of mistakes.
Right.
And so we want him to be brilliant, but also, a bumpkin. And we want him to be a genius, but also a fool and uneducated.
Right.
Because we need a flexible view of Joseph to be able to cover all the good and the bad.
Right. Oh, yeah. Right? You need flexibility. Trust me. Yeah. You got to be pretty flexible to make it work. And we just don't like talking about certain things that are inconvenient, that contradict the dominant narrative.
Yeah.
And so, I start there, and, he was fantastic at storytelling. And, would talk about, the Native Americans and the history, for hours at night. His mother in her book recounted how he would, enthrall with stories about, the Indians and all this, and, their manners of dress and warfare. And later on we can get into the context. I think it was Vogel and Hamer that you did talk about the Book of Mormon context, because one of the billboards we did was the story behind the Book of Mormon. Is that what we called it? Mm-hmm. The first one was treasure digging, which caused a little bit of a ruckus. So then we went to the Book of Mormon. So it's been pretty well covered. But can you go to the image of the brown rock?
Okay. Is that the second image?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Let me pull that up right now.
So I'll summarize while you pull that up. But extensively documented history of the treasure digs. And basically, if, Joseph Smith saw God when he was, 14? He spent the next decade digging for treasure with a rock before he brought forth the Book of Mormon, which we can talk about next. And so the church, I mentioned this picture of this slide in the rock, because the church has finally come out. This was 2015. This was the first official, I believe, release, an acknowledgement that this was the brown seer stone that Joseph Smith actually got from the Chases while he was digging with the Chases. they considered it their rock and wanted it back, but Joseph kept it. And this was the rock that brought forth everything, So you're starting to see acknowledgement recently of this new narrative. There's another thing in here I didn't put.
And it's probably worth mentioning that for a century or more, as Mormons, we see the painting of Joseph with some Urim and Thummim breastplate, with the plates in front of him and a sheet, and he's translating stuff.
Right, sure.
And that's
a very physical process.
That's the story we've all been told. There's no stone, there's no hat, and none of us were ever taught any of that. Yeah. So it's a real, it's got to be a conscious attempt at not telling the truth, because the church has known this for a long time in one way or another.
Yeah.
And so we were misled. I think.
I will go further to say every contemporary participant, witness from Emma to Cowdery and the Whitmers and Rigdon, all speak to a very different process than plates on a table. No one ever saw or touched any breastplate. That's covered with how that idea of spectacles got introduced by a competing treasure seer, and now Joseph was stuck with that idea. But he pretty quickly parted with the notion of spectacles and went with the rock and the hat because he needed to narrate a story. But it's all there, and I found it fascinating. I truly found it fascinating to just read. The original firsthand accounts of the people closest to the event described it very, very differently. And that's what the church is trying to weave in and work into, because it's unavoidable at this point. So you've got to shift the narrative to dictating a story. And they're starting to paint images now with a hat on the table, at least. They're introducing the hat, And I will suggest, as you get into this, if there were just one or two or three or four or five issues that really didn't add up, Joseph Smith, Book of Mormon, priesthood, polygamy, Book of Abraham, blah, 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 on down the list, right?
First vision.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If there were just a few issues that didn't square, I could live with that. But I suggest as you get into this, you have to really, really want to continue to believe and then some people do that, and they do know the history. But there's a lot there. There's a lot there.
And so the treasure digging is kind of relevant because it's same with L. Ron Hubbard. We covered this when I interviewed recently Chris Shelton from Scientology. It's always important to understand the history of the founder of your religion.
Yeah.
And L. Ron Hubbard was kind of this guy. He went to World War II.
Yeah.
He ended up writing a bunch of Pulp Fiction novels. Sure. He was actually a polygamist who married a different woman after the war. So he was actually legally married to two people at one time.
Perfect.
But then he's doing these books, but then he's like, oh, wait, what if I do a self-help book? And so he writes a self-help book. And then finally he realizes, oh my gosh, self-help's one thing. A religion can really, and so knowing that history, of course, we're all going to say L. Ron Hubbard's a fraud, right?
Well, yeah.
But knowing what the founder was doing prior,
of course it matters.
Helps inform and helps you understand what he was doing. Well, and we don't get that history.
No.
We were never taught that Joseph was doing treasure digging for 10 years.
Well, and then you get to, and let's poke fun. The Scientologists believe, the plan is Xanadu or Xenu or something. Xenu, right?
Xenu,
Hey, but we have Kolob. It's anyway.
Yeah.
But back to Joseph Smith, we learn about the glass looker trial. I had never heard about Joseph being arrested for treasure digging, and it was a pretrial hearing, and he was, quote, convicted. They would have handed him over for future date, but maybe they the bailiff escorted him out of the county, and there's a receipt for that trip, and blah blah blah. But he was basically testifying about treasure digging with his family and Josiah Stowell and these different people. A family member, made the complaint because they were tired of Joseph Smith defrauding the relative out of, money and time and treasure digging. Treasure digging doesn't work, by the way. I'm just going to share that. All these little shiny things in the ground. There's no coin. There's no gold. There's no, Oak Island, Captain Kidd treasure. And There's a fun quote online there about Ben Franklin deriding treasure digging a full century before Joseph Smith.
I love that quote. Read it.
Yeah.
Read it.
All right. So Ben Franklin,
And I read this in the Dan Vogel interview.
I love it.
I got it from you, I think.
Yeah. Well, I got it from somebody else. I don't know. This is Ben Franklin 100 years before Joseph Smith. There are among us great numbers of honest artificers and laboring people who, fed with a vain hope of growing suddenly rich, neglect their business almost to the ruining of themselves and families, and voluntarily endure abundance of fatigue in a fruitless search after imaginary hidden treasure. At length, a mighty hole is dug, and perhaps several cartloads of earth thrown out. But alas, no keg or iron pot is found, no seaman's chest crammed with Spanish pistols or weighty pieces of eight. Then they conclude that through some mistake in the procedure, some rash word spoke, some rule of art neglected, the guardian spirit had power to sink it deeper into the earth and convey it out of their reach. Well, this is why treasure digging was illegal. They called it disorderly conduct.
Right.
And it was
glass-looking,
the village juggler and glass-looking, because it was discredited 100 years before Joseph.
It's almost like Benjamin Franklin was a prophet.
Well, it's almost like Benjamin
Because he's describing Joseph Smith.
It's almost
100
like
years before Joseph Smith.
I'm just glad that Ben relied on the scientific method because I'm a huge fan of electricity and things that work, So Dan Vogel, and by the way, Dan, I mean, you're the man. I mean, he's just done a lot to help us understand the history. He says Joseph told followers that his early persecutions resulted from his visionary claims, but his severest persecution actually stemmed from his activities as a treasure seer. And this is relevant because there's so much supernatural built into the Book of Mormon and the Jaredite rocks. God touches in the shiny rocks and treasure sinking down into the earth. The land is cursed. I mean, that's all in the Book of Mormon. This narrative of treasure digging and cursed earth and treasure slipping away, that might not be ancient Indians writing that. That might be early 1800s treasure digging lore.
Right.
Yeah,
a lot of people, when they read the Book of Mormon, they don't, when it's talking about things in the earth and treasure and they don't realize that that's likely just Joseph autobiographical stuff being written into Mesoamerica.
Yeah. And then do you really think that treasure slipped down into the earth? I mean, I did. That's just, because you're unrighteous and they're not prospering in the land. And you should prosper in the land when you're righteous because Book of Mormon. But even the Oliver Cowdery, it's in Revelation, the Doctrine and Covenants. Oliver Cowdery's divining rod skills were codified in the original Book of Commandments. They called it Oliver Cowdery's gift of working with the sprout or the rod of nature. It was his divining rod skills. And then they changed it, they altered it when it became the Book of Commandments. It was the gift of working with the rod. And then they changed it again. They altered the Revelation when it was compiled into the D&C. It became the gift of Aaron. Kind of mask as the generations or years went on to mask this proximity to supernatural treasure digging.
So part of what your essays show is this chronological editing of the story to become more appealing over time and less weird, less cultish, less problematic. And that's just, I'm sure we all would do that. It's like, oh my gosh, that sounds weird. Let me make it sound less weird.
Of course, yeah.
We're not necessarily impugning people's motives, but when you see revelation in Scripture be altered significantly, materially over time, and not just Revelation.
Oh, and there's bigger ones than that.
Yeah, the Scripture too. The Book of Mormon has been, and the Book of Commandments, Doctrine and Covenants have been changed, where meanings have actually been reversed over time.
Well, of course.
You're able to show a lot of that.
Well, the nature of God changed. Was it Nephi? Was it Moroni? The angel's name changed. And we'll get into it later on the alterations. The biggest alteration was the entire priesthood restoration, which was inserted years later, and we'll get to that. But I wanted to mention that the treasure hunt that the entire first presidency went on in Salem, Massachusetts in 1836.
Because Joseph was poor and he needed money.
Joseph was always poor and always needing other people's money.
And so he got this revelation, that there's a treasure somewhere in Massachusetts, right?
He read or heard some story about treasure being under a house. And so and the beauty of this is it's recorded in his letter he wrote to his wife, Emma, in his own handwriting. And he said, Joseph Smith wrote to his wife, Emma, with regard to the great object of our mission, confirming the mission of this trip was the treasure dig. You will be anxious to know we have found the house. And the house is occupied, and it will require much care and patience to rent or buy it. So they position this as a missionary tour and some public relations things going on there. But the reality was the mission was to go dig treasure to get Joseph out of his perpetual financial trouble.
And in your mind, did Joseph really think there would be treasure there, or was he fooling people?
Truly, truly amazing part of this. And this goes back to, was Joseph just a pious fraud? Was he full deceit from start to finish? I mean, and I don't know that my opinion matters here, but I believe he believed he had skills to see things. I mean, he would vision, he would see, he would hope, never mind that they never once came to actual fruition.
Didn't find anything.
Never found anything,
Unless it was something he had hid.
Right.
So that he could fool people, right?
There's
like a feather.
There's stories of that, of the needle. But again, you've got to take it all in the greater context of what was occurring here.
Yeah.
So and the Urim and Thummim is worth mentioning. I had no idea that the Urim and this is the Urim and Thummim. The brown rock is the Urim and Thummim. So the very term Urim and Thummim didn't exist in the context of the translation until years later when W. Phelps speculated that the interpreters, as they were called, may have actually been the Urim and Thummim mentioned in the Bible. And from that point on, they started calling it Urim and Thummim, and they retroactively inserted that word into the literature that we all read now, not realizing that that's not what the original people were talking about. But that the brown rock... So Vogel, again, I'm going to quote him, he said, one must be cautious in reconstructing the original story, especially when citing portions that were influenced by Joseph's later emendations. I love how diplomatic he is. You have to be careful when citing portions that were influenced by his later, changes. Because he would just retroactively insert this stuff to make it sound more like the narrative that developed over time. They'd go back and insert that years later. And you don't know this unless you look at the records and see when and what. So the historians have always known this, and that's why most of them got excommunicated, because this is just super inconvenient to the narrative. But the spectacles never existed. No one ever saw plates. The rock was the Urim and Thummim. And the rock is what really brought all of this stuff forth. Which, if you're okay with what the Book of Mormon is, and you're okay with that, and you believe it is what it claims to be, well then, okay. But if it's not, and as we get into that, it's interesting to look back and say, for me, the most powerful stuff was looking at the availability of material and the context of what early Americans were thinking of the Native Americans, the Indians, as we were displacing them, the Indian Relocation Act, and forcing them off of their lands, and that was, God's divine destiny to gather the tribe again, as we murdered and displaced Native Americans. I mean, this is just what they were talking about. There's context behind all of this.
Yeah, and to be fair, Richard Bushman would claim that all of this seer stone looking treasure digging stuff was Joseph learning.
Sure.
Learning is kind of like the X-Men when they're young. Like Cyclops is in the bathroom stall, and all of a sudden his laser beams shoot out. And
supernatural
cuts
awesomeness.
Down the whole, cuts down the whole building, or or like Rogue is kissing her boyfriend, and all of a sudden veins start popping out of his head, and he starts dying. Richard Bushman's version would be that all this tomfoolery is Joseph learning.
It's preparatory.
Learning how to use his gifts.
Oh, awesome.
And that's fine. Again, if you can believe that Jesus resurrected, there's a lot of things you can believe. So
and I'm careful to stay away from that.
No. But what's undeniable is that we weren't told any of this stuff.
Of course.
And that the church hid it from us.
Absolutely.
For as long as they possibly could.
Oh, and then some. And there's stuff I took off the website. And maybe it's still on. There's a video of, it's McConkie and others absolutely denying that, Joseph used the stones. It cannot be. And, they're all authoritatively speaking to it's simply irreconcilable. And prior, I think Joseph Fielding Smith, and others have said, no stones. Well, yesterday's prophet is today's heretic. When the church changes its mind and throws them under the bus, they just change their mind,
Okay, we have a listener that wrote in. Her name is Julie, and she said, "Wait, so there was no plates?" That's a question.
Yeah, I mean, well, this ties into the bigger picture of you need to spend some time with the notion of Lamanites. Was America really founded just 2,000 years ago, or whatever, by some Jewish Indians on horses with swords? And did they bring over records on gold plates? And, are Lamanites real? That's a fundamental, critical question to this equation of, were there some really advanced Hebrew Indians running around the Americas, wherever, north, south, mid, whatever,
baptizing people, talking about Jesus,
knowing his name before Christ was born,
before Jews knew his name, in the Holy Land, right?
Were they really running around writing on metal plates? And have we found any of those metal plates in Jerusalem where we might have excavated a few things? And there's apologists that'll say, yes, oh, absolutely, there were metal plates. But if you look at the original firsthand accounts of people that were there, and even as we get into the witnesses, which we're going to talk about that next in the Book of Mormon section, they all saw these things through visionary states, and not even all together. Remember, Martin Harris, had to distance himself, and
when Joseph was showing the three witnesses,
right,
the plates,
they didn't see it together.
Martin didn't see it.
He didn't see it.
The others saw it. So that's really important. That begs the question: like, wait a minute, if material plates are being shown,
right,
why didn't all three of them see it? Why did two see it and one didn't?
Right.
And then Martin had to go away and then come back and try again.
Well, and then later he said it was 3 days later. Was it the next? Did he come back? And later in life he said it was 3 days later, and he described things. And this is the complexity. We're talking about witnesses. We're talking about Book of Mormon. We're talking about archaeology and Lamanites. So that one question that was just asked, this is why it's so hard for people to uncover the truth. It's a rat's nest of complexity. And we've all grown up on a certain narrative. And it's hard for people to back up and say, what? There were no plates. Okay, well, how could there be plates? One, if Lamanites weren't real, you got to spend some time on that. But two, all of the original people there never say they saw plates with their eyes. Okay?
No one.
Nobody ever said, and touched, the angel turned the plates. And the original contemporary accounts depict a visionary state, which ties in with the treasure digging.
And so people understand that there's this idea of seeing things with your spiritual eyes, and we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
But when the witnesses actually did, have an experience,
right,
they weren't seeing it with their physical eyes.
Yeah.
They were envisioning it in their mind.
Oh, and it gets better.
If Joseph can get them to say, okay, can you envision Moroni here with the plates?
Right.
They're like, okay, I can see it. I can see it. That's how the plates were seen.
And chastise them for their lack of faith and righteousness, and you'll see it if you're faithful. And what's fascinating is what else they saw. If you look at Martin Harris and even Oliver Cowdery, a number of them claim to have seen the plates in vision before Joseph showed them the plates. They saw, Jesus as a deer. They saw, they saw all these things. It's all. I go to the witness page because I don't want to speak out of turn and get it wrong, but the witness page recounts some of the other things they saw and when they saw it. So I think it's relevant to consider what else they saw. But there's a picture. Let's come to that. Let's come back to that. But the question was, were the plates ever there? I would just encourage you to read the essays, dig deeper on that. And even Joseph's mother claimed to have felt the interpreters through a cloth or something, and she described him in a manner that she couldn't have possibly known if she felt it through a cloth, the diamonds or the stones. But yeah, no one ever saw any breastplate or interpreters. The plates weren't even in the room when he was dictating into his hat. They were off in the woods, hidden or wherever. But yeah, no one ever saw plates.
And so one option is that God is it's really important to God that nobody see the plates.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the Book of Mormon musical really makes fun of that.
Yeah.
Now don't let anyone see the plates.
Well, you'll
it's
die.
only for you to see.
Right.
Even if people will question whether it's real or not, that's kind of what God is going for. So it's like God, Joseph can see the plates, but the witnesses, but again, if I were in isolation, that's one thing, but you add it all together. All right, so keep going.
So anyway, I would encourage you to read the essays on that. But let's just roll through Joseph Smith here and then maybe take a little break as we dig into then First Vision and the Book of Mormon. But I think it's important to evaluate the character, because you're talking about, just like you would today, your character, my character, somebody you're going to invest with, somebody whose church you're going to go to. If there's a history behind that of fraud and abuse, that might tell you something that maybe, there's more to there. So I'll have to be brief here because this is alienating to people that still revere Joseph Smith as a restorative prophet. His character and his track record is so full of things that don't square. It was shocking to me to learn what he was actually up to. But I would go to the Kirtland episode again briefly, where he was denied the charter to start a bank, because there actually were some rules back then. It wasn't total, frontier Wild West. You had to go get a charter to found a bank. And they denied his charter because he didn't have any sufficient capital. So what does he do? He says, well, we're just going to do an anti-bank. We're just going to do our own bank.
We'll call it an anti-bank. A non-bank.
Non-bank.
It's a non-bank bank.
Nothing to see here. We're going to do it anyway. And there you've got witnesses like Wilford Woodruff in his journal. Warren Parrish, said that he had the audible voice of God instructed him to establish an anti-bank. Proceed. What's interesting, everybody else, the Cleveland Weekly Gazette, they were warning that he would take up what little money they have and depart hence, which is what he did. When he fled town, when it all vaporized, he fled back to Far West, was welcomed home as a hero, welcome home the prophet, and he started off again there. But that's why today, Kirtland vaporized and we lost the temple, and that's when the witnesses started talking about, hey, we never really saw the plates, and
Mormons just, the way that we've been taught the history is just that they're always evil people persecuting Joseph and his righteousness. And why was he chased out of New York and then out of Kirtland and then out of Missouri and then out of Illinois? Right. It's just because Satan always goes up against evil people.
Of course.
But the truth is, like, in every single city he fled, just like L. Ron Hubbard, by the way, there was always a major scandal that preceded him fleeing.
Oh, preceded and followed.
And so like in New York, it was that, he had all these buddies that he was treasure digging with. And finally he's claiming to find these golden plates and everybody's poor. Yeah. And they're like, well, we want to see them. Where are they? Because number one, I thought we were partners. And then number two, where are they if you really claim to have found them? And and people knew about his history kind of as a charlatan. And so like that, the heat got too big. And so thus he flees to Kirtland. Kirtland, like a third of the members of the church left the church, not because even the very elect shall be deceived, not because Satan rises up in adversity against God's chosen people, but because thousands of people lost their life savings.
But after Revelation asked them to contribute. Yeah. So there's a lot there.
And you bring that up out of chronology because you're trying to speak to credibility, right?
And there's the land speculation and the constant, leveraging of other people's money and the immigrant incoming saints, to buy his land and leverage. And that picked up steam later in Nauvoo. And there's a ton of material there that we can get to that I want to show about when he was, giving away parcels of land to his, new polygamous teenage wives and other people. And Emma was granted massive property and, the commingling of funds. And then it's all been discussed. But basically the land speculation and there's just so much there. We could talk for hours, the tarring and feathering at Nancy Miranda Johnson Hyde, right? When he first got himself tarred and feathered at the Johnson's place.
It wasn't
like 32.
Because Satan was against it.
Well, that's when he was rolling out the United Order, consecrate all thy properties to the church.
In other words, give your money to me.
Well, yeah, and that's when he figured out the Book of Mormon wasn't going to sell. The Golden Bible Company had failed. All the books were left behind in New York, and he ran off with Rigdon. Before Harris even lost his farm, Joseph had fled the scene to westward for Rigdon. The Book of Mormon virtually is unspoken of from then on from Joseph Smith. It was shocking how absolutely irrelevant the Book of Mormon became once he left it behind in New York and the books didn't sell. And we can get into that, the agreement with Harris to sell the books and, sell the copyright and all that. It all became Rigdon's communal living society of other members supporting this community. And Joseph went around and amplified that and, revealed to members they should consecrate all thy properties. That revelation was later altered and changed. It was for the building up of the mercantile. And then later they changed it to the building up of, the storehouse for the poor, because that sounds better. But yeah, it's just the record is there.
But the Miranda Hyde thing was almost castration. Why?
Well, so there's two theories of thought there. One was, they were just angry at him for his aggressive solicitation for land and money, because that was the time he was rolling out, give us all your money. And others say, or both, he was affectionate or intimate with their teenage daughter. Now, here's what I found fascinating, and it's all in their chronology. 10 years later, Joseph Smith, as prophet, as leader of the whole town, sent her husband, was it Orson Hyde? I get the Hydes mixed up, or the Orsons mixed up. Sent her husband on a mission to Jerusalem, and then married her without his knowledge through this whole scheme and rigmarole of making this happen. So 10 years later, he did secure that very same Nancy as his wife. I mean, he's persistent.
Right.
That's the chronology, is showing you what he did and when he did it. And again, that may seem like nothing now, when he got her, married her while he sent the husband out. But look back 10 years. Was he trying to be intimate with her? Did he wait 10 years? The fact of the matter is he ended up marrying her later. So these are all things I had no idea.
Without Orson knowing, right?
Yeah, your husband's gone.
You send him away on a mission.
And then you take his wife.
Take his wife without the husband knowing.
And there's the whole lot of circumstances of how he was able to buy the time and seasons with someone else's money. I mean, he bought that with one of the, with the money of one of the orphan sisters that were living in his house, either the Partridges or the...
Right.
Yeah. It's just kind of behind me now.
So your point there is he had credibility problems. For as long as he lived, he was doing things that,
right,
in any other context,
right,
if John DeLynn in 2019 did 100th of what Joseph did, I would either be put in jail or killed.
Oh, and that's even before you get to the polygamy. This
right.
was just dealings with money and power and abuse of authority. It's just start to finish, top to bottom.
Yeah.
I mean, they got him on at the end. He was going down for treason, attempted murder. Did he really have Boggs assassinated? A year prior, he predicted he'd die a violent death. I mean, there's just so much there.
Right.
Yeah. And I didn't know any of it. But again, I think this is where we can get into the weeds of how much of this minutia matters to you. And I would just pull it back and say, hey, from a high level, there's more to Joseph's character and credibility here. If this is the restorative prophet of the restoration who saw God, there's so much here that's hard to square. There's an episode here that I think is powerful.
Let me just say, one of our listeners, Scott, writes, "Thank you guys for doing what you do. So many people are still so blinded from the years of conditioning. I am grateful for the work you have done." Leandra writes, "Being active LDS is like trying to view the church through a shattered telescope advertised as stained glass. It's only when you stumble upon the broken pieces and start fitting them back together that you see with true clarity and realize the crookedness of it all."
Yeah.
And we're not saying those comments are right or wrong. We're just sharing what listeners.
I appreciate everybody's comments and participation. On the land speculation, there was one quote that I particularly like, because I try to find things that are in Joseph's original contemporary, even better in his handwriting. But the closer you can get to the source, and versus years later from someone else. But Joseph Smith wrote a letter to the owner who he had purchased this Nauvoo swampland, bottomland from, and he was decrying it as a deathly, sickly hole, unable to realize valuable consideration. But he said he was keeping up appearances, holding out inducements to encourage immigration. Okay, and the source of that, by the way, is the history of the church. So Joseph's decrying it a sickly hole, who he's enticing and holding out inducements and keeping up appearances. And then later he was boasting to another press how he had bought up 900 acres and all the others had to purchase land from him. So again, I get that 1830s and 40s were kind of different than now, but it's really not. It's not that different.
Yeah.
It's not that hard.
Right. Okay, what's next?
Well, the images you have, I love Sarah Ann Whitney almost as much as Joseph did, because
Am I pulling up an image?
Yeah, pull up the... Sarah Ann Whitney provided us with glorious records in Joseph's own handwriting, because they didn't burn the letters as per instructed.
Okay, so I've got the first letter up here.
Is that this one?
Yeah, with the tape down the middle.
Yeah. So basically, Sarah Ann Whitney was a teenage daughter of the Whitney family, and who had just recently been sealed. Joseph had, given them their sealings. This is 1842. This is while he's in hiding to avoid, I think, a second arrest for extradition for the attempted murder of Governor Boggs. So he's hiding, and he writes this love letter to the Whitneys to come and to bring their daughter. But and you'd have to read the letter. It says the only thing to be careful of, find out when Emma comes, to come get the fullness of my blessing. Never mind, they'd already been sealed. I mean, what more you got, right? So come when Emma's not here with your teenage daughter. And by the way, burn this letter, after you receive it. So, but they kept it. So it's all in the archives. You've got the Joseph Smith Papers Project, printing this stuff, but it gets better. So then what he does is, to secure this deal with the Whitneys for their daughter, he gives her a parcel of land.
Is this the second letter now?
The second slide should look like this.
Okay, yeah.
So this is the actual parcel deed with Joseph's signature on it. By the way, this was church property that the saints had paid for. So he's giving it to, I think she was 17. There's no evidence that she paid for it, but I'm not aware that 17-year-olds were generally buying
landowners.
17-year-old females, much less.
And so that paper says what, basically?
Well, he gave her a plot of land 1 block away from his house, so she could be nearby.
So that what?
And that part of that, I think, was
so that he could have an extra kind of thing on the side. Well, and Emma, I mean,
hey, I'm just sticking to the facts here.
Okay.
Here's the land, and then I think the Whitneys wanted a little more surety here, and they wanted confirmation here. So he wrote him up a special blessing in his own handwriting. That's the next slide.
Okay.
So this is the blessing that Joseph wrote out for the Whitneys, and here's the beautiful part. Again, this is in Joseph's own handwriting in a church's archives. Her and her entire extended family were promised exaltation. It says, for as long as she remain in the everlasting covenant to the end. Well, the everlasting covenant, today we've understood that as, the sealing of families to eternity. The everlasting covenant was polygamy, right? And so this is Joseph trying to secure a teenage daughter by giving her land and blessings of eternal salvation as long as she remained in the covenant. I mean, that's a pretty big, and that theme becomes constant throughout his acquiring of young brides and other men's wives, was this promise of salvation and being closer to the prophets, and it's a big deal. But it gets better, and so basically, in order to cover his tracks, she's turning 18, and she would be expected to date, right? But because she's secretly married to the prophet, I'm sure Emma didn't know about this either. He has to cover his tracks. And so he sets up, remember we went back and forth, should we call it a sham wedding? Should we call it a fabricated wedding?
Yeah.
Remember?
Because I was trying to soften the language.
Right. In my essay, I called it a sham wedding, and we didn't want to alienate people. I said, we call it whatever you want. But so here's the actual, the wedding certificate, right? And so Sarah's sister had passed away. So the brother-in-law was in mourning because he'd lost his young wife. So Joseph sets up this arrangement whereby that mourning widower would be assured to be sealed to his deceased wife, Sarah's sister, as long as he enters into this sham wedding with Sarah, who's really already married to Joseph. And so this is just kind of how he does things, is, promising salvation and land and eternal salvation as long as you stay in this sort of manufactured marriage. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we're now finding that's available to anybody that just wants to know this stuff. In the past, you had to read massive volumes and dig and,
So which essay talks about the sham wedding?
I think this one I put right on Joseph Smith to represent character.
Okay. I'll include a link to that in the Facebook thread.
Yeah. And then I'll just wrap this up because I'm going to need to take a little break myself here. Helen Kimball's another beautiful one. She's on the polygamy page, This is the one that they talk about several months before her 15th birthday, which means, she was 14. And the pressure to help her take that step and, go into securing the salvation of her, father's household. And, this promise was so great that I willingly gave myself to purchase so glorious a reward. I mean, you've got Lucy Walker, her mom dies. Joseph promptly sends the father away on a mission, and he housed the 4 oldest kids, and he informed, the 16-year-old Lucy that she had one day to decide, and that's disputed. But basically, there's things in here where you can see Joseph's affinity for the orphan, nannies living in his household, or the young nannies they're living in his household. And that was when Emma was away on St. Louis purchasing supplies, so that's why I think the context and the history is so powerful, as you can see what was occurring in context.
And this is, it's language. We talked about sham wedding. Mm-hmm. Language is really tough here because this is the type of stuff that makes it hard to conclude anything other than that Joseph was a sexual predator. And that's super extreme and harsh language for a Mormon to hear. But if you study Harvey Weinstein, if you study the Me Too movement, if you know anything about consent, if you know about power differentials, why is it bad for a boss to sleep with an underling, right? Yeah. It's because he's got power. And so the underling can't give full consent to the boss, because the underling might be worried about their bonuses, might be worried about their raises, might be worried about whether they could lose their job.
Oh, and that's just
or
in
just
the workplace.
Might be affected by undue power and influence, right?
Well, and that's not even considering if your mother passed away and you're living in the prophet's home and you're dependent upon him for survival. I mean, polygamy was really important to God. Because this stuff's important. And so, getting this stuff done and getting these young girls, married to Joseph was really, really important.
Well, one of our listeners writes, Christy writes, "Angel with the flaming sword."
Right. Yeah, he had to do it.
God cared.
Had to do it.
You think about it, like there are all sorts of problems that could have been resolved. Like God could have solved the race problem back in 1830. He could have said, "No, let's love black people and they're equal," or "Let's treat women equally," or "Let's gay people, let's love them, and let's make sure that there's never any suicides." There are all sorts of or war or famine or just kindness or civil war's coming, whatever it is, the opportunity God had, earthquakes, famines, disasters. God had lots of opportunities to care about a lot of things.
Yeah.
But what's he sending the angel with the flaming sword down for?
Oh yeah, it's game time.
It's to make sure that the wives that Joseph wants to take, who many of them live in his own home or minors, or 14 years old, let's make sure that they do what Joseph said. And that goes back to just this idea of consent and power differentials and predatory behavior. Joseph isn't just their boss. He's not just their employer. He's not just like 20 years older than them
he's
or
not
whatever.
Just the mayor. He's not just the head of the legion.
He's the head. He's the mayor. Yeah. He's the head of the army, of the military. But he's also God's mouthpiece on the earth.
Oh yeah, and he's living under his roof.
Yeah. But I mean, it's just and then he's not just saying, do this because I said so.
Right. Oh, no,
he's saying, what's he saying?
Well,
if you don't.
Well, yeah, there's threats, but there's promises. There's the carrots and the sticks.
So what are the threats? What are
some
the
had threats, right?
So if Emma doesn't sign up,
this window would close, or Emma's going to be destroyed if she doesn't.
You'll be destroyed by God, right?
Of course. And there's a loophole there where if she doesn't approve, we can go around her anyway. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But there's so much here, and in this, you get to also the the Partridge Sisters. It's not just one episode where you say, well, golly gee, we just don't know. I mean, there's such an appeal to ignorance. Once you get into this stuff, you really have these arguments made that we just can't know. We just don't know. We can't know. We can't judge them by today's standards. And I'm not asking anybody to judge them by today's standards.
Yeah, I think this stuff was inappropriate by 19th century standards as well.
Yeah, well, that's why they kept arresting him, and
that's why he kept running away. That's why he was being tarred and feathered.
He was constantly fleeing
he was
west,
being put in jail,
to the
right?
frontiers. Yeah. And again, John, I didn't want to know this. I wasn't trying to smear Brother Joseph.
Right.
This guy was a prophet. I mean, I joined this church. Well, I was born into it, but I stayed in it with my testimony because Joseph Smith saw God and the Son, Jesus Christ, and restored the gospel. And then he got busy taking teenage nannies and other men's wives and a whole bunch of other things that I was unaware of. And I guess this is just scratching the surface, John, of kind of what was going on. And again, there's some awesome articles by real historians. Ben Park wrote Nauvoo.
Benjamin Park, yeah.
Benjamin Park wrote a great one about this and polygamy in Nauvoo. There's links on the website. I mean, it's pretty much, historical fact. But there are apologists that'll bristle at what I just said. It's historical fact because they've been saying, and it's not worth naming names, but there's some that are just borderline polemic that'll just go to any length to suggest Joseph Smith didn't have sex with these young girls, even though the church's own historian last month or something, shared his opinion that it's totally confirmed that they did. I mean, they'll go to any length to preserve Brother Joseph in that image that we have, and you can do that. You can do that if that's what you need to do. I suggest that most people aren't probably going to go to that length once they see what's going on.
No, actually, I think most people will go to that length. I think most people don't want to know the stuff and won't want to learn it, and that's fine. Right. That's their choice, as long as, in my view, they have the chance.
Yeah.
But it's deeply problematic, and about the apologists, and I'll just say it's Brian Hales, it's Daniel Peterson, and not to attack them, but it's disingenuous to acknowledge that polygamy was all, the Book of Mormon itself says that polygamy is about raising up righteous seed. It's about offspring. Mm-hmm. And who's going to deny that from Brigham Young on, those, why do we see the prophet with 10 wives and 90 children and grandchildren? Right. It's because they were having sex. So polygamy was always about sex.
Oh, no one argues Brigham. Nobody argues Brigham.
That's my point.
But Joseph,
that's my point.
They defend Joseph.
It makes no sense. It's disingenuous to say that from Brigham on, it was all sex and babies and lots of wives. But for some reason, Joseph, it wasn't about sex. It makes no sense.
Right.
But it's even worse because we know that several of Joseph's wives gave legal affidavits, testified that they
Temple Lot
that they slept with Joseph, that they were married in every deed. They used biblical language, but if the wives themselves are saying they knew Joseph in a biblical sense, and multiple of them, in depositions with lawyers for courts of law.
But the church itself throws the original witnesses under the bus later when they say that Martin Harris's testimony shouldn't be trusted later in life. He's just too darn old and senile. And when it's inconvenient, they disavow. But, of course, they cling to it when it suits their needs. So I get it. I mean, I get it. It's just that wasn't my path, and that's not what I saw.
So really quickly, we're about to take a break for lunch, and then we're going to come back and keep digging in. Kate writes, you'll love this. Uh-huh. She says, this, brilliant. I wish so badly this chronological, true, laid out church history was available when I was thick deep into my crisis. My head was busting at the seams trying to make sense of it all. I wanted to do this very thing, but it was all too overwhelming, so I never started.
Tell me about it.
Thank you. Thank you for taking time to compile this important information in a well thought out timeline. This is awesome and so badly needed. Yeah. So how does it feel to have kudos for the timeline?
I sat right here on this couch. A lot of that happened right here with papers and books spread everywhere, compiling, and I'd see something on, a website or a historian's link or a comment, and I'd go check, do I have that? Do I have that date? Is that current? And there were errors I had to fix and tune up, and believe me, anybody, pro or con, faithful or unfaithful, if you see something in there that needs fixing, I'll fix it. But yeah, it was hundreds and hundreds of hours of compiling.
Yeah.
But, it's hopefully helpful.
Well, Luis writes, this is like that global warming video, The Inconvenient Truth Bombs. Bridget writes, this is going to help so many of us. So many people are writing in. Sadie writes, I cannot thank you both enough. This is exactly what I've needed. You have no idea how many people you are helping by doing this. Thank you. Christy writes, according to church lessons, he was arrested, jailed because of religious persecution.
Right. Trumped up charges, usually. Trumped up charges,
right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So many people writing in saying that this is super helpful. Yeah. And I don't have time to read them all.
No, but I hope so. Thank you.
But that's why, we're doing this extended interview with Mike Brown. That's why we published Mike Brown's essays on the Mormon Stories website under Truth Claims. You can go to the menu, Truth Claims, and start digging down. There's 31 plus essays there. And it's basically just a labor of love and a labor of truth, where Mike started with, Richard Bushman, Michael Quinn, all the top church historians, then going to original sources, has compiled his best take at a factual, fair, comprehensive understanding of church history. And we're going to go grab lunch, and then we're going to come right back and dig more into it.
Sounds good.